this, for me personally, will forever remain a day of mourning and tragedy. And I'm so happy to see all of you here today, and that we're taking the time to commemorate the sacrifices of all of the protesters who resisted the coup in Egypt, and the tens of thousands of people impacted by the murder of over 1,000 people on that day at Rabaa and Nahda squares. My last visit to Egypt was to interview survivors of the Rabaa Massacre, and I will never forget those days with people lining up, screaming to tell us their stories, and listening to people describe how security forces shot dead, wounded people lying down, people trying to flee, how they set fire to the medical centers and the mosque. It was a grotesque act of barbarity. And I think the point that Human Rights Watch, where I was working at the time, emphasized in our investigation of that crime was that this was a planned, premeditated crime. And we know exactly who the perpetrators were, including General Sisi, who was defense minister at the time, the commander, Medhat Manshawi, and of course, Interior Minister Mohammed Ibrahim. And we will be persistent in demanding accountability for them and against them, and knowing from the experiences of many countries in the world that this is a long struggle and a long quest, but it will not be forgotten. So we started working on an investigation of the massacre in Rabaa, but also Nahda squares right after these crimes took place. Some of our staff were actually at and around Rabaa Square when the massacre unfolded. And then, we really didn't realize what a massive investigation it would end up being, but we ended up interviewing over 200 victims, witnesses, and so forth. And our investigation not only, I think, documented the exact number of people who were killed in Rabaa, in Nahda, and 4 other incidents that occurred in the 2 weeks of those days, where, in some cases had over 100 casualties. But we were able to document the extent to which the massacre was planned and organized, and that the government knew that there would be thousands of victims. They anticipated that that would be the consequence of their efforts to end the protest, to attack the protest. We were able to document how they surrounded all the entrances to Rabaa camp, gave very little warning to people, but then wouldn't actually let people leave, and blocked it, and then of course proceeded to attack the camp with heavy equipment, with snipers directly firing at people, with arson attacks on the medical camp and the mosque where people were sheltering, and very intentionally and deliberately committed this massacre. Our investigation was able to gather quite a bit of information about the planning of the murder, the cabinet meetings that were put in place by the interim prime minister at the time, and with the principal planners of the massacre, whom I mentioned. We advocated very strongly at the time for an international investigation, and pushed the UN to call for an international investigation. The head of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time, Navi Pillai, did call for such an investigation, but the Human Rights Council did not. And so there was no official UN investigation, unfortunately, of the massacre. When I traveled to Egypt the year after the massacre in 2014 to release the report, along with Ken Roth, who was the executive director of Human Rights Watch at the time, the Egyptian government refused to allow us into the country. And so we actually left to Geneva and did what turned out to be the first virtual press conference that Human Rights Watch ever had. Little did we know that in a few years, everything would become virtual. But at the time, we realized that doing this virtual conference allowed journalists from around the world to attend and hear the information about what had happened. Unfortunately, for the international community, I think Rabaa was the moment that for them demonstrated that the resistance was over and that General Sisi was firmly in charge, and they proceeded to align themselves to support Sisi. And the brief hold on weapons to Egypt from the United States was removed, and the weapons flow, the billions of dollars of weapons flow, resumed, and more importantly, the arms purchases by Egypt dramatically increased, which I think we can also see as a very useful tether to keeping Western governments, as well as Russia, close to the Egyptian government as now important purchaser of weapons in the world, despite the catastrophic budget. I think everyone knows what has happened in the past 10 years since, with the level of repression and abuse, really a reign of terror in Egypt that we haven't witnessed under prior dictatorships, such that people now remember Mubarak as a kindly dictator in Egypt. But unfortunately, General Sisi has managed to remain in power with the support of his Gulf dictatorship allies, as well as the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, his strongest supporters. And I think, the most challenging aspect of this for me as an American is seeing so nakedly how my government can continue to close its eyes to the massacre, how Secretary Blinken, when he was in Cairo 2 years ago, actually put out a statement from Cairo, remembering the Tiananmen massacre and commemorating its victims without any sort of apparent irony or sense of irony that he was making that commemoration from Cairo while he has had nothing to say about the Rabaa massacre. My current organization, Dawn, founded by the late Jamal Khashoggi, is based in part on my experiences at Human Rights Watch and my understanding of how dictatorships like Egypt survive by virtue of its support from the United States and Egypt, is focused entirely on challenging U.S. foreign policy and U.S. support for dictatorships in the Middle East. Because I think that's where we have the greatest responsibility as Americans, but also where we have the greatest opportunity, to the extent that we have democratic processes in our country that should allow us to move away from these nefarious policies.